Good afternoon, buenas tardes, and thank you for tuning in. On behalf of all of us at the locally based, independently owned bookstore Books and Books in Miami, Florida, and in partnership with Miami Book Fair, it's my pleasure to welcome you to a virtual afternoon with Juan Gabriel Vásquez to discuss Songs for the Flames, stories published by our friends at Riverhead Books. The characters in Songs for the Flames are men and women touched by violence whose lives are changed forever, consumed by fire and by unexpected encounters and unyielding forces. Winner of several of the world's most prestigious fiction prizes, including the International Dublin Literary Award, Spain's Alfaguara Novel Prize, and published in 28 languages, Juan Gabriel Vásquez is one of the most celebrated writers alive today. The English language publication of The Sound of Things Falling was an instant bestseller and earned enormous critical acclaim, putting him on the literary map in the United States. Juan's next novel, Reputations, firmly established him as one of the finest writers of our time. And after the release of The Shape of the Ruins in 2018, The Economist called him the most famous novelist to come out of Colombia since Gabriel García Márquez. To moderate this afternoon's conversation, we're joined by Phil Klay. Phil is a veteran of the U.S. Marine Corps and the author of Redeployment, which won the 2014 National Book Award for Fiction, and Missionaries, which was named one of the 10 best books of 2020 by the Wall Street Journal. His writing has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the Atlantic, and elsewhere. He currently teaches fiction at Fairfield University and is a board member for Arts in the Armed Forces. Throughout this afternoon's broadcast, you're invited to ask questions by using the Ask a Question feature at the bottom of the screen. So please go ahead as you listen and post your questions, and Phil is going to get to some of those right after they talk. And you can order your copy of Songs for the Flames from Books and Books Below, or any other book you might want, by pressing the green button. We sincerely appreciate every order and the generous donations that are coming in from viewers everywhere. And now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome our guests to the virtual stage. Hello, hello.
Hello.
Hello. Thank you so much for having us, Books and Books, and everyone, please get this book. If you already have it, get a copy to give to somebody. This is just an astounding piece of work. I am so delighted to be talking with you today, Juan. You're one of my favorite writers. I didn't know if you could write short stories. You know, not everybody can, and it's incredibly obnoxious of you to be able to having such skill with novels as well. I want to talk to you first, and I think this is motivated in part by how I'm feeling right now as a Marine watching what is happening in Afghanistan. I want to talk a little bit about shame, the shame of escaping violence. So much of this book seems to circle around what we make of ourselves long after we've escaped the violence that has touched so many other lives. You have a photographer capturing others' faces in the weight of their stories. You have veterans of the Korean War. It's a complicated story. You have a novelist who bears many similarities to you, whose best friend dies in a military training accident, and so on. So many of your characters are the lucky ones, but are haunted by the less fortunate. Why this subject?
Yes, thank you for that insight. It's a pleasure to be here. First of all, thank you, Books and Books, and thank you, Christina, for the warm introduction, and thank you, Phil, for doing this. It's a pleasure to be in conversation with you once again. So yes, I think you're quite right. Most of the stories, if not all of them, seem to capture the characters in a moment from which they're looking backwards in time. Memory is a big subject in the book, as it is in my novels. Always this intention, right, to investigate your own past that doesn't come off really well most of the times for the characters. And it all turns around this idea that the past is always moving, is always changing, and it's not fixed like we would like to think. My characters, I'm trying to surprise my characters at a moment in which a certain aspect of their past is changing, or a certain aspect of their past, some sort of a ghost, some sort of a memory comes back to haunt them and to change their present moment. Most of the time, I think in more than half of the stories, the narrator is a character similar to myself, who shares pieces of my biography, who is a writer, and who meets somebody. This is just my way of dealing with the similarities between these narrators' curiosities and my own. We both seem to have a keen interest in the lives of others, and we both seem to go through life feeling that behind the people we meet, there's always a mystery, there's always a secret. And the story is the attempt at throwing some light on that secret. Now, what you are signaling is quite accurate, I think. That secret, most of the time, has a lot to do with escaping violence, or saving yourself from violence, or surviving violence. And so I guess I think my character, this is what my character is trying to do. My character, who is a writer and who investigates in the lives of others, he's trying to figure out, how did others survive violence? Maybe because he has survived episodes of violence himself. So that I think this is a very interesting moment, and I think this is something that you do very well in Missionaries, which I wrote to you about. It's characters who survive episodes of violence are infinitely interesting. The way you do that, the way you deal with an episode of violence, is infinitely interesting, and I'm trying to shed some light on the ways we do that.
Yeah, there's a character, and one of the things that makes your stories hard to talk about is there are surprises in your stories that are the really good, like, plot surprises. And I mean that, not in a cheap way. They're not twists, right? They're sort of what the Ross McDonald talked about, how at the end of a really good mystery, the changes need to echo past, echo sort of backwards through the story, so that you reevaluate this sort of, you have this image of the character that you're forming, and then it twists and twists with the different revelations, not as some sort of cheap trick, but because that's how we encounter other people, and sort of deaths, emerge. But it makes it difficult to talk about your stories because I don't want to give anything away. But there's a character in one of your stories who hasn't gone to war. Now, it's a war that he doesn't believe in, right? A war whose justification he feels is false. He sort of sees how young men were manipulated into going to it, how they were fed patriotic and heroic falsehoods, and he hasn't gone. And yet he's compelled by this war he avoided, and this violence he didn't take part in. And there's a sort of shame attached to that. Why that honor that we pay to people going into violence, even when we think that it's the wrong war?
Yeah. Well, it's a big question, and one that I should ask you. I think you would have more things to say than me, definitely. Well, one of the difficult things about this genre, about the short story, is that you have to pack all these enormous questions into very little space, right? I've often thought that one way to understand how short stories work, the kind of short stories that I like to write, which, as you say, are not the ones with the little twist at the end, is that a story is the climax, the defining moment of another story that is not told.
Yeah.
This is how I try to approach the genre. So as soon as the story ends, the reader should feel there's a huge backstory to all of this. There's a novel's worth of information and conflict and psychological changes behind this little gem when it works well. This little epiphany that we have just experienced in the course of 20 pages. So what does this mean for your question? That you don't have the time to discuss all these, the sheer size of the concerns that you have mentioned. Why do we have that relationship with certain kinds of violence and not others, right?
Yeah.
This kind of worship of certain kinds of violence and not others. Our difficult relationship with the different kinds of wars there are is part of what I was trying to write about. The book deals with what we could call official wars, like the Korean War, to which my country sent a battalion in 1950. Nobody has ever really figured out why. And this is one of the questions that the story tries to ask. But there are also different kinds of wars interrogated, explored in the stories. One is, for instance, the war against the drug cartels, or between the drug cartels and the state, that shaped my adolescence and my late childhood and my early adulthood. These years were shaped by this other war that was happening on other theaters of war, not the usual ones, not the conventional ones, but which shaped this war, shaped my life and the lives of many people. There's a story there in the book called, what is it in English? Boys?
The Boys.
The Boys. Which can be read as a metaphor of my generation. This is the fact that we were living through all these, through the bombings and the killings in the streets and the shootings of important people. It took me a long time, and it has taken many people in Colombia a long time to realize how that shaped our very intimate lives, even as children who were not, sharing the theater of war with the people who were fighting it. I was trying to interrogate that aspect of, or rather, that kind of war too. And then there are other kinds of violence. The book, if it has one thread going through all the stories, is trying to explore how we deal with very diverse kinds of violence. The idea that violence comes in one shape and one size, I think is the false truth that the book is trying to debunk most of all.
Yeah, you talk about, I think it's in The Boys, the inertia of violence is like a deep underground current that nobody can reach. And that story has, these kids who are alive during the time, and they live in a gated community, so they have a certain degree of protection from it, but they're aware of it. And there's a fantastic scene where they sneak out of their gated community to go visit the site where somebody was executed, right, where somebody was killed. And it's the way that this sort of kind of smaller society of just a couple of kids who all get together and they have fights. The way the things that those children are doing are these sort of echoes of what is happening, and it's their attempt to find some way of not even verbalize, but sort of physicalize what they're feeling in relationship to a society in the midst of war. It's a fantastic story. in the very opening of the book, I wanted to talk about too, because I think it's you being a sneaky writer. You write, other people's stories are inviolable territory. Or that's how it's always seemed to me, because often there's something in them that informs or defines a life. And stealing them in order to write them is much worse than revealing a secret, right?
Yeah.
Which is
what I do during the rest of the book. Right?
I love it. And you read that, it's like, it's such a profound statement that he's just going to violate. Exactly. And even within that story, after having made a big deal about how, I'm only telling this story because this journalist told me the story and said, you have to tell it, right? Exactly how I'm telling you, with no pyrotechnics, no embellishments, no tweaks. And so that's what I'm going to do. The story actually turns out to be not the journalist's story. It turns out to be the story of a woman that the journalist met, right? And, I had this feeling, you write about these things because you care about them. But when I was doing research in Colombia, I was interviewing somebody who had grown up in a paramilitary town, right? And my wife's cousin, her father was like, "Oh, you should go along on this interview and learn, about, what's happened in your country." And it's like I think she was 17 or 18 at the time. So she went along with me to the interview. And he's telling me these stories, and they're just like horrible stories, right? And then, we walk away, and I turn to her, and I was like, "That was a great interview." And her face is white, and she says to me, like, "Only now, do I realize how lucky I've been my whole life." And I immediately felt like a vampire, right?
Yes.
Because I wonder how you negotiate that sort of, the kind of grand green, there's a sliver of ice in the heart of every novelist who, sees trauma as like, this is material, versus, even though you're bullshitting a bit with that line, I do get the sense that you have that respect for the material, right? Yeah. How do you sort of deal with your kind of ethical response to the fact that the stories you're writing, whether or not they're related to things that really happened or not, do express real things that happen to real people they have a deep, emotional weight on? Yes.
I think the answer has to deal with the beginning of our conversation. All these stories, most of them, not all of them, but most of them try to be stories about witnesses. The characters are witnesses. The stories are not happening to the narrator most of the time. The narrator is somebody who is gathering other people's stories. And when I said before that this had a lot to do with how I walk through life, this kind of curiosity about the lives of others, it was a humble word, a humble way of putting it. It's not curiosity. It's on one hand fascination, and on the other hand a deep sense of respect and of being in a way in debt with the stories of others, with the lives of others. It's also a confession of my own ignorance, my own limited knowledge, which is also one of the reasons you write. I write fiction as a way of enlarging my understanding of what we are capable of as human beings, which turns out to be quite a lot, in the good sense and in the bad sense too. So this is why most of the stories are investigations into somebody else, right? The guy telling the story just discovers that somebody else is not telling the whole truth, or he suspects that there's something hidden behind what others are trying to tell us, or just the life of someone else turns out to be a place of such depth and such ambiguity that trying to write a story well about that life is the only way of paying homage to other people's experiences, right? And I think this is one of the beautiful things that literature can do. Try to pay homage to other people's experiences. This is what the stories try to do.
Yeah, in that same paragraph, you say, your narrator, who's a lot like you, says he'll write the story fully aware that I am the way she has found to see her story told by someone else, and thus to understand or try to understand something that has always escaped her. And that seems to me the real gift of literary art, right? That it's an individual story, but represented through another consciousness who's holding up and examining different colors and textures of the experience and recasting it and allowing us to see ourselves differently, right? And that, we don't simply take a story, but we give it back profoundly altered in both sense of the word, right? Does that justify our vampirism?
Yeah. Yes, I don't know. This is a big question. Yes, but I think it does. I mean, I think the justification comes with, not to put too big a word on the whole thing, but your ability to tell the truth. The truth is a big word for short story writers, I think, much more so than for novelists. Tolstoy used to go on a great deal about the truth, but I think when you get to Chekhov, to his short stories, the idea of looking for the truth in somebody else's life, looking for the truth in a certain scene, in a certain emotion that you try to capture, trying to find what is true in what somebody else has lived through. I think it's one of the great things that we can do with fiction as a tool.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about this quote that a friend of mine loves, by Logan Pearsall Smith, I think his name is, which this is a writer that I haven't read. I haven't been able to find this quote anywhere, but I keep repeating it in my head just because this friend of mine loves it and because it's a beautiful quote. He says, "The great art of writing is to make people real to themselves with words." This is one of the things that I look for as a reader. Give me the words with which to make sense of my own experience and to try to feel my own life is more real. This is why I read the writers I read. And I certainly hope, if it's not too much of an arrogance, I hope that my stories can give some reader the feeling that their life is more real. Some reader lost in the middle of Colombia who has experienced, I don't know, the war on drugs, or who has been in the army, or who has, and who reads a story and says, "This is how I felt. This is how it felt." It's the big goal that these stories set for themselves. I don't know if they achieve it, but this is what they're trying to do.
There's the last story, which I think is a masterpiece. You begin talking about that truth, and you say you're going to tell not one story but several, or a story with several beginnings at least, although it only has one ending. And I must control them all the beginnings of all the stories, so none may escape, because the truth could be in any one of them. The timid truth I'm looking for in the middle of these outrageous events. And I love that, the outrageous events and the timid truth, right? Which is so essential. You write novels that deal with politics, that deal with outrageous events, right?
Yes.
And it seems, I think oftentimes we want fiction to tell us how to feel about the outrageous events.
Yeah.
Right. And yet you seem focused on the timid truth. Why is the timid truth? First off, why is it timid, and why is that the important thing?
Yeah. Well, let me just say, first of all, that when I was listening to you, I thought that's a nice sentence. And I thought it's a nice sentence, not because I wrote it, but because the word chosen by my extraordinary translator are so good. So, so let me just take this opportunity to say thank you to my translator, Anne McLean, who has done a wonderful job, as she always does. She's a magician, and my stories couldn't be in better hands. So yes, it's I think the difference for somebody who works in novels and in short stories, both, like myself and like you, is why one genre or the other? Why do we use one genre rather than the other? And I think for me, it all comes down to the size of the emotion. There are movements in our consciousness, or emotions we experience, or yes, it's movements of our sensibilities that are so small and so fragile and so timid that this big machine that is a novel wouldn't be able to capture them properly. It would be like trying to fish sardines with a net used for dolphins or something like that. What you're trying to capture would escape if you try to use the novel to capture that precise feeling, which is fleeting, and it's fragile, and it's volatile, and it's small. This is why you use that particular kind of net that is a short story, and so you try to capture that emotion and that feeling and try to examine it. This is the only chance we have to examine it. It's very difficult to explain this, but no novel would ever be able to tell us what The Lady with the Little Dog tells us, Chekhov's story. This kind of emotion is not something you deal with in novels. Novels are too big, too encompassing to deal with these kind. But if we didn't have the short story as a genre, if we were not able to capture that small emotion, the one contained, for instance, in A Cat in the Rain by Hemingway, or in, I don't know, The Aleph by Jorge Luis Borges, or The South by Jorge Luis Borges, if we didn't have the tool of the short story to examine, to capture and to examine these things, we would be poorer. We would have lost on something. And so this is the timidity of the truth that I was referring to in that paragraph. This is a small kind of movement of our sensibility that I'm after. And this is a story that is rather long. It's 50 pages long, and it deals with wars. It begins in the First World War, and it comes to Colombia in the middle of what we call la violencia, the violence of the 50s, of the 40s and 50s. But in the middle of all these big scenarios, what it is looking for is a very small human emotion. And this is why, with this material that I think would be able to give me 2 or 3 novels, I chose the short story to try to explore it and explain it. It's a short story about many things at once, as I'm sure you read. I haven't been able to figure out what all these things are. I think I tried to write the story to find out what I was writing about. But they're about women. The story is about women, and about women in a world of men in the 50s. A woman trying to become a journalist when it wasn't her position in the 50s in Bogota, a conservative society, to become a journalist. It's also a story about chance and about chance encounters. But it's also about literature, about a relationship with words and with poetry and with the stories we tell. So how do you deal with all these very disparate subjects and curiosities, within a very contained frame? This is what I try to do. That story, by the way, is hugely influenced by many people. I mean, I see Chekhov's longer stories there, but also by Alice Munro. In a way, she was quite present when I was writing that.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah.
Story. I don't know if it shows. What do you think?
No, that makes sense. I wouldn't have picked up on it, but that makes sense now that you. It's another writer I feel passionately about, where different narrative frames sort of come up against each other, and where your sense of event suddenly turns. I love that story. You're writing this in a story that deals with La Violencia, and there's these bits where she's hearing reports of violence far away and thinks that violence will not come, or that if it is coming, it's going to come with a heavy tread, right? You moved back to Colombia in what, 2012?
Yes.
How did moving back to Colombia affect your fiction? And what was it like writing a story about La Violencia right now? Not that it's about La Violencia, but that deals with it.
Yes, it's partly about that. Yeah. Well, when I moved back to Colombia in 2012, I had spent, 17 years abroad, and I had written all my books from a distance. The first one is a book of short stories called Lovers on All Saints' Day, which has nothing to do about Colombia. These are characters moving around in Paris and in Belgium, the places where I lived, and experiencing love and losing love, and they're the old genre of the sad love story. This is what I did 7 times, 7 sad love stories set in these places that I have lived in. So the book had nothing to do with Colombia. Then I published a novel called The Informers. This was 2004. And from then on, I didn't write one single page that was not obsessively about Colombia. Now, the reason I'm telling this is the enormous difference for me that exists between my 2 books of short stories, Lovers on All Saints' Day, and this one. In this one of the things I tried to do was to explore the same let my country in the stories, let my country's experience in the stories. And of course, one of the aspects of my country's history that I obsess about the most is violence, is the question of why and how do we deal with it and how do we survive it, which is in all my novels, in The Sound of Things Falling, in The Shape of the Ruins, in the last one that I have just published and hasn't been translated into English. All my books, at least in a small way, try to ask questions about violence. I came back to Colombia in 2012. This was at the same time as it was revealed to the Colombian society that the government had been carrying on negotiations in order to have serious negotiations with the FARC guerrillas. So I came back at the same time as the country was trying to end a 50-year-old war. Somehow I see that in the stories. I see this anxiety about our violent past the possibilities to end one of the several threads of violence that have plagued the country, and are different ways of dealing with the causes of that violence. So there are the episodes of political violence in the 50s, the episodes related, I'm talking about the Book of Stories, the episodes related to the war against the cartels and its consequences on our lives. So in a way, this is inseparable for me from the fact that I moved to Colombia as my country was trying to deal seriously with the possibility of ending the war, ending this war.
Yeah.
Are there many other wars that we have to deal with? Yes, of course. And this is what the stories try to reflect also, the myriad ways in which violence takes place in a country such as mine. But they try to tell small stories about small people. And this is what is different, I think, from my novels that try to capture a very big political and social landscape. These stories are about intimate human beings trying to deal with the death of another, or with a moment in which violence touches them from a distance or a little bit closer, or even that kind of metaphorical violence that is a difficult surgery. This is the subject of a story about a band of corridos. So all the stories are trying to deal with, to ask these questions. How do we deal with these moments? Why do we inflict pain on others? How do we deal with the pain that others inflict on us?
Yeah.
And the way I tried to talk about all these things as products of a political world that is out there, it felt to me to be such a transformation from my first book of stories, which deals, as I said, with small love stories set in Belgium and France. It has nothing to do with what I was trying to do here.
And there's also, and I should, to folks in the audience, if you'd like to type in a question, I can ask that of Juan. There should be an ask a question box. So, you can type that in at any time. And then I'll start asking those.
Yeah.
But, there's also the sort of, the narratives that we spin, or the kind of cultural scripts that we have access to, whether it's the sort of scripts about like how a war veteran is supposed to talk about a war, or with a woman in Songs for the Flames, has her life described to her secondhand in terms of how the priest talked about her, right?
Yeah.
One of those things that has been especially strange for me watching, as a veteran watching what's happening in Afghanistan right now, is watching different narratives getting spun by the political class, of shaping reality into a sort of pleasing form for sort of more utilitarian purposes. And I wondered if you thought that, when you're writing about fictional subjects, and especially where the process of uncovering stories and the different sort of angles of approach into different lives gets foregrounded, whether that is in some ways a sort of, I don't know if antidote is the right word, because that would make it sound like you're writing in order to sort of cure us of our political delusions, but some sort of space outside of that sort of political rhetoric that, when we dwell in, makes us sort of more capable of reflection about who we are, and political reality.
Yes. Well, I think one of the main oppositions between fiction writing and the political discourse is, or rather, one of the best reasons to write fiction about the stories we're being told by politicians or in the political world is this attempt to give them back their richness and their ambiguity and their humanity. Political diction is almost always not only clear, but insultingly simple. The attempt of political diction is to simplify things, to say to the audience, to the reader, to the listener, things are much simpler than you think. You don't have to worry. I have the answers. Fiction, on the other hand, is bent on the opposite mission. Fiction wants to say to you, things are much more complicated than you think. Yeah. They're full of shadows. They're full of ambiguities. There's always another version. There's always another approach to the same facts. And in order to understanding them, in order to achieving a certain kind of illumination about these public facts, we have to welcome all the stories, all the versions of the stories. This is what fiction does. It tries to welcome the different opposing, contradictory sides to the same kind of story, and in that sense, try to give their ambiguity and the richness back to these events that have been oversimplified by political discourse. This has a lot to do with your previous question, because one of the things I became aware of when I came back to Colombia in 2012 was that these negotiations that were taking place were also a negotiation about the story.
Yes.
We were also asking ourselves as a society, which is something that is taking place right now in the US and also in many other countries in the world, we're trying to say who has the right to tell our story, right? And what story is that? We became aware as Colombians that the story of the war, if told by a victim of the guerrilla, was quite different from the story of the same war when told by a victim of the paramilitary, and very different from the story of a victim of state crimes. All these are different narratives. Politicians don't believe in that. They believe each one of them believes their own version of the past is the only one that should be valid and validated by any kind of social negotiation. And what we novelists and short story writers try to do, what you try to do in your own fiction work, is say, hey, let's recover as citizens, recover the right to tell our own story and to respect the shades of gray and the ambiguities and the diversity of the stories. Two of the stories in my book, the first one and the last one, deal with women. Because one of my concerns was, as I wrote the book, as I imagined the book, was what was coming to the surface in the discussion about the Colombian War, how women had been among the greatest victims of the war, how the body of women became a field of battle for these combatants. And so how do you write about that? How do you try to respect the kinds of pain and suffering that these situations have caused, but also respect their ambiguities and not weaponize these stories politically. How do you explore the emotional and the moral consequences of women in my country being used by the soldiers in the war as instruments of the war, or as the places where the war is taking place? These are all very painful and difficult questions. And what these two stories try to do is capture a moment in which we may have a little bit of an illumination of what is going on there, what is happening when a woman suffers in this particular kind as a victim of violence. So yeah, that's it.
We have a question from Catherine Suseta Gomez talking about Colombia. Do you think the wounds from having violence as part of your daily life can be healing?
Very good question. I'm not sure. Perhaps they can be healed. But the one thing I'm sure of is that the only way of achieving some sort of closure is full knowledge, is an investigation into the past. As long as the past remains unclear, as long as stories are not being told, as long as the suffering of certain victims is not being recognized by the community, and this means the stories we tell, right? As long as we don't accept the need to fully illuminate our collective past as Colombians, the wounds will not be healed. And I think this applies to individuals too. I mean, this is one of the great paradoxes of violence. The only way of moving towards some kind of forgetting is to remember correctly. Remembering violence accurately is the only way that individuals and also societies can move past it to some kind of informed oblivion, right? And so, yeah, I think healing might be possible, but I think first we have to face the difficult facts about our collective and individual pasts.
Yeah. Majub Alam has a question. Since you're relying on memories, how much does the book reveal about the author? My answer to that would be don't trust whatever Juan's about to say.
You shouldn't. No, particularly when the author has taken the risk of inventing a character that resembles him very closely. So you do that because there are some stories that have hit too close to home, and you feel that to invent a different character would, in a way, falsify them. And this is what I try to do. I try to close the gap between the author and the narrator, because these stories were very, very close to me. Now, having said that, because I chose that strategy, I'm not at liberty to say anymore. And I think if I did, I would, my writer ID would be taken away from me. So yeah.
And then Books and Books asks, what are the challenges and joys of writing stories? Have you read George Saunders' Swim in the Pond in the Rain?
Yes, I have. And it is a masterclass. I love that book. Well, I've always loved Saunders' stories. But to explore these stories that he chose, being also a big reader of Chekhov myself, it was a lot of fun. I think it was. I've always felt curiosity about the fact that this relationship we have with short stories in our continent is very different from the rest of the world. I mean, the Latin American tradition and the American tradition, perhaps along with the Irish tradition, are the only ones in which short stories are taken as seriously. Are the only ones in which you can build a, a whole career and a whole reputation only on the strength of short stories, as is the case of Borges, for instance, in Latin America, or Raymond Carver, or Alice Munro, right? These writers that never or almost never touched on novels. And this is something I kept thinking about while reading Saunders' book, and something that I think always when I read American short stories. This we kind of worship the genre. We write under the impression that it is important. It has important things to say. Laurie Moore is another American writer that I place up there along my favorite living and dead South American short story writers. In my tradition, every major novelist seems to feel the need to publish a book of short stories just to be taken seriously as an artist. And this tells you a lot about our relationship with the form. This is absolutely different from what goes on in Europe, in the Spanish tradition, in the French tradition, in Italy or in Germany. Short stories are, by the wider public, are usually considered a minor form, like, something you do in between serious projects like novels. And this is one of the reasons why I'm so happy to have this book published in America, because it has a strong relationship with the way short stories are read in the US.
Yeah. We have gone on, I think, a little bit longer. Give a second for folks to do any last questions, if anybody wants to throw them into the chat. But this has been an absolute pleasure chatting with you, Juan.
For me too. Thank you.
I have a ton of other questions that I had typed up to tell you, but
my answers are too long. This is always my problem.
No,
they're not long enough. They're not long enough. We worship short stories.
Yeah.
So, and I was just thinking, God, are we the lucky ones that can listen in on these conversations? Oh my gosh, the pandemic notwithstanding, just being able to put people like both of you together in conversation and listen to what happens is just glorious. So I just want to thank you both for joining us, for giving us your time, for your work.
Thank you.
It's been fabulous. Order Songs for the Flames by just pressing the green button here on the screen, or you can come to any of our stores if you're in Miami and pick up a copy there. And I sincerely hope that we can do this again sometime, and that we will see you in person someday soon.
Absolutely.
Yes, wouldn't that be good? Thank you. Thank you for
Congratulations. Congratulations on the publication. And thank you so much for everyone watching.
Thank you all.